He's an award-winning author, commentator, and documentary producer. He was among the first Western journalists on the ground in Afghanistan in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and was there at the very start of the war in Iraq. Through many years, Sennott has covered wars and insurgencies in some 15 countries, and most recently has chronicled the Arab Spring as a correspondent for PBS Frontline. And he has led teams of reporting fellows in the field for GroundTruth and Global Post in Egypt, Burma, Haiti, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond. Please join me in welcoming Charles Sennott.
Thank you. Thanks, Edwin. Edwin is an extraordinary photojournalist and a perfect example of the kind of young people we're working with every day. And Edwin's joined us and has done some really unusual work in Puerto Rico about the economy there and about the tremendous challenges it faces. So I want you to please check out his work. Thank you, Edwin. I want to thank our hosts today, the International House, and I want to thank the Overseas Press Club, and I want to thank Freedom House. We all wanted to come together today to observe World Press Freedom Day. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about GroundTruth. I think all of you know the work for the most part, but just to underline it, we are really trying to train, mentor, support a new generation of correspondents to tell the most important stories of their generation. And today you're going to hear from 4 top young journalists who we think really embody that new generation, who are doing amazing work. And we'll definitely be hearing from them. The morning here was extraordinary. If those of you who were here, there were 20 young journalists who were in the workshop this morning. Maybe you guys could just stand up for 1 second so everybody can get a sense of who you are. These young journalists spent the whole morning here really taking a workshop to create an introduction to risk assessment and to really do something that is very dear to the heart of the GroundTruth Project, which is to be sure this new generation of journalists works safely. Thanks, you guys. You can sit down. They're really extraordinary. I mean, these are journalists like Mohammed Abdel Fattah, who we worked with through Open Hands Initiative, a wonderful nonprofit that's done support for our programs in Burma and Egypt. He went from Tahrir Square to covering that other area of civil unrest called the Trump Rally. And it's an extraordinary journey. And really, each of the correspondents who were being trained this morning have unbelievable stories and are doing unbelievable work. And for those of you who are from news organizations, need your support. They need to find places for their work. So I'm hoping lots of conversations are going to be happening across the generations here. The real purpose of the morning was highlighted by International House's CEO and President, Calvin Sims. I think many of you know Calvin, extraordinary journalist, New York Times bureau chief in many different parts of the world, and now President and CEO of this place, International House. A friend of mine was asking me, like, what is International House? I won't try to tell you the whole history, but find out. It's a really interesting residency program for international journalists to live in New York City. International students to come together and live and have a place where they can live in New York City. It's a great history. Calvin is a proud part of that. But Calvin in his core and in his DNA is a journalist. He's part of this tribe. And Calvin today said that even though times were different in the 1980s when he started out as a journalist, one thing hasn't changed, and that's the need for young people to be out there in the world, on the ground, and finding those important stories and telling them to the audiences they report for. That's never going to change. Vartan Gregorian of Carnegie once said, "The truth will never go out of business." I love that quote. We face a lot of challenges in the media industry. Those shifts in the media industry have recently caused a lot of news organizations, big and small, to rely on freelancers. And those freelancers are, many of the people in this room are going to get their starts in their careers as freelancers, because the opportunities for those staff positions are few and far between. And I think it's changed the landscape of what we do, and it's shifted some of the responsibilities. It's shifted our sense of how we're going to have to train them and how we're going to have to support them, and be fair to them as news organizations, as publishers, as editors. It's really changed the relationship. And there's a movement underfoot that recognizes this, that recognizes that we live in a time of rising journalistic peril, but we also live in a time of limited resources, when the business models are challenged, and when how we're going to sustain journalism is a big question on the table. And I think we have to, as we think through that equation, keep in mind that safety needs to be in the forefront. There are many in this room who are thinking this through and who are leading in that. The OPC Foundation has done an outstanding job. John Danishevsky is here from AP, and who's also been a big part of this leadership. Really, everyone in this room is somehow tied to that initiative and that effort to create this new culture of safety. What that means is so important in this moment when we're seeing the numbers rise of journalists facing extraordinary risks and sadly facing harm. Some have been killed. Every 2 weeks, a journalist is murdered somewhere in the world. 2/3 of those attacks are outright murders. 1/3 are killed pursuing the story, whether they're caught in a crossfire or in a dangerous place covering a dangerous conflict, or in a car accident, or pursuing a story out in the field as a journalist. We know these stories because some of them were really close to our heart. Jim Foley worked with us at Global Post. Jim Foley was a friend. He was an unbelievably talented correspondent. And he is among a number of journalists killed recently who were dear friends of mine. And they include Marie Colvin and Tim Hetherington and Anthony Shadid. And the list is sadly very long. But I know every one of those correspondents who I know from the field would want me to immediately point out the fact that of those killed in the field, 90% are local journalists. 90% are Iraqi journalists, Syrian journalists, Mexican journalists, Colombian journalists. And as much attention as the murder of Jim Foley got, because of the public nature of his execution and because it became a turning point in our industry where we recognized the peril was so extraordinary that we have to do something. It was galvanizing. But I know Jim Foley well enough to know, he would want you to know that it's the Syrian journalists who were his compatriots, who put up an unbelievable public message of their great sadness and respect for him. I don't know if you ever saw this photograph of the Syrian journalists holding up a banner saying, Jim Foley, you know, we loved you, we loved your work. They're the ones who are at the most peril. Another fact that's really important to point out on this day, World Press Freedom Day, is that of those killed, 90% are killed with impunity. There's never a prosecution. None of this is resolved. When UNESCO started World Press Freedom Day, I believe it was in 1993, the idea here was to find a day where we could think about this, where we could really step back and remember. And we could have a tradition where we reflect on the challenges we face, but also the freedoms that we think should be celebrated around World Press Freedom Day. That we all have a right to a free press, and we're going to have to work a lot harder if the world's going to have it. On your chairs from Freedom House, you have a report that will tell you about where we stand right now in the world with World Press Freedom Day. And you will see in that report, the statistics are pretty devastating in terms of where we are as a culture in the diminishment of our freedoms for journalists. Press freedom declined to its lowest point in 12 years in 2015 as political, criminal, and terrorist forces sought to co-opt or silence the media in their broader struggle for power. Only 13% of the world's population enjoys a free press. We have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of journalists to remember, some of whom were held in captivity and have been released. Roxana Saberi is with us, who knows what that's like, and we all remember her being captured, held in Iran thrilled when she was released. Our friend and colleague, Jason Rezaian, was just released from Evian prison in Iran, and he was the person who lit the candle of remembrance at the Overseas Press Club dinner just last week. Today is a day to take a moment to reflect on the journalists around the world who've risked their lives and those who we've lost. And it's traditional to have a moment of silence, so I thought we would have a moment of silence. Thank you. I want to say that my goal today in bringing you together was to reflect on an important time in our industry, but also to allow a conversation to really open up across the generations. That's what this morning was about, and there were some great moments this morning of humor where you have people like Judith Matloff saying things under a headline like, should we talk about hurricanes now? One of the other ones was sort of, how do you know when to wear a chemical suit and how? These are things that we never thought we would get into when we were studying journalism, but they are very much a part of our reality today, sadly. And I think we're going to have to continue to have a conversation that goes from the veterans of this field to the new people coming into it. You're going to hear from 4 of those people, as I've said, in a panel discussion, which Deb Amos will lead. NPR's Deb Amos, one of the great veteran correspondents, is here. Deb, thank you for being with us. But we're going to start off with a conversation between myself and a friend and colleague who I greatly admire, Bob Woodruff. And Bob, do you want to come up so I can introduce you?
Young journalist you talked about.
Yeah, that's right. We are indeed. So this older generation of journalists that we're not part of has a lot of stories to tell. And Bob, your extraordinary journey at ABC News as a senior correspondent and being brought on as an anchor and taking on a big role at ABC News from the minute you started there has been a pretty extraordinary journey. I want you to talk a lot about what you're doing today, but I think all of us would recognize that a searing moment in your story came in January of 2006, if I'm remembering correctly. And I was at that time at the Nieman Fellowship in Cambridge, Massachusetts, far from the front lines where recovering conflict reporters go to take Irish poetry, life drawing. And I was really reflecting on this business we're in, and had just covered Iraq and Afghanistan, and had been over there for about 8 out of 12 months of the year. I was trying to do a detox when I got this terrible news that you had been severely wounded on assignment in Iraq. And I think everyone in this tribe, everyone in this community was devastated because your courage, your spirit for what we do is so strong. So I thought maybe we could start there at this searing moment and just ask you to reflect a little bit about that day, about what lessons there are to learn for a new generation of correspondents from that day.
The best thing to learn is duck. The world of IEDs now. But, it's so interesting just the way that we met, right? I met them both Charlie and I were based in London, and 9/11 had not happened yet. And it was, like a week before 9/11 happened, we met each other, 2 guys, 4 kids each, traveling to dangerous places like idiots do. Right? And I think a lot of it too is, this is a great message you did tonight, because I think sometimes we get so much criticism as journalists all over the world, especially during when people are running for president. But then those that have never been to a country, the recommendation is for those that do criticize to go to the countries where we don't have the freedom, or the people don't have the freedom to report. It's a good lesson for them to do, is just travel a little bit, and you can realize how important it is, and truth will not go out of business, there's no question about it, because we realize that. But I remember we met each other all those years ago. Yeah, so if you're 4, that was the 8th time in Iraq for me.
Right.
It was the first time that I embedded with the Army, in Iraq, because leading up to that time, we were able to relatively travel freely through Iraq. It was, well, actually, I should say that I was embedded with the Marines on the invasion into Iraq. But then the ones after that, we were able to wander fairly freely through it. I think it's really in the spring of 2004, when we're seeing a lot more use of explosive devices, IEDs. And we also knew we were getting targeted, especially as journalists. I know the one that changed significantly as well was, not long after 9/11, when Daniel Pearl was taken captive, and we realized then that the days of Yugoslavia and coverage of the Milosevic days, and those that are the so-called enemies, they didn't want to tell us their side of the story. They really wanted to send a message to the rest of the world that they can do what they want and we can suffer, and then we would have to react with extreme spending of money and operations to try to stop this. So what happened in 2006 was, there we were with the Army. They were January 2006, there was a State of the Union that President Bush was going to deliver, and I wanted to go to Iraq to see because the topic was passing the power of the U.S. military over to the Iraqi military, which was the dream at that time, and I just want to see how it was operating. And we got into an operation, with a mid-operation on the ground in Taji. And we're just driving down the road, and then of course this IED exploded, which changed everything. So since that time, I've not gone back to cover wars. The only time I've ever been back to Iraq and Afghanistan was with Admiral Mullen, because the security was pretty damn good, and I can get that okayed by my wife and my family to go back.
It's the true risk assessment.
Yeah, because you're talking about all these shifts. Everything was going from Iraq to Afghanistan in those days. But yeah, so now I'm not covering wars anymore. I like covering conflicts. There's something on the sound.
There's the phone, Charlie.
My phone? I will turn it on. It wasn't ringing.
Good chance it was on. It wasn't ringing. But yeah, that was a real change. That was a changing moment.
Did you hear that one?
What?
Print reporter.
But yeah, that changed everything for me and my family. There was some resistance to me covering a lot of those dangerous places, but this was the one where they could win the argument, and I decided not to do it anymore.
Bob and Lee have written an amazing book about this experience that draws on sort of how it changed you, how things came sharply into focus about what I guess really matters in life. But there are also some pretty powerful lessons in there. And I'm just wondering if for a generation of correspondents that are going out in the field, beyond duck, which isn't bad advice, it's very good advice, things have really changed. We have gone from being in the crosshairs of taking on risk to do what we do, which is an age-old risk, to going from sort of being in the crossfire to being in the crosshairs. We're a target now. No one wears those vests that say press anymore. No one puts TV on top of the car like we used to. It's a different culture. What advice do you have for them as they go out into it?
I don't know exactly how to say. I think best was the instructions were given earlier before this meeting, just now, because those that have been studied well. But I think it is best to go and find local people that know the country well, that know the neighborhoods well. It's interesting when you do go embedding, is those are the people that don't know much of anything about the area where you're in.
Right.
It's remarkable that those that are serving in these kind of countries, in the modern war coverage. I mean, there was a time, Vietnam, you knew all the local people in Saigon, and then you would disappear into to cover the wars. But now people are really secluded within the bases, so they don't really know the local areas as well. So you don't have the ability to wander the country with the military. Right. That's really limits the way that we can cover the wars.
Right.
So that changed. We were able to know all the local people in the old days, And certainly, most of the countries you can still do it, and
Right.
the ones that don't, a lot of you have already reported at. But in the ones that are in very intense, dangerous war zones, then you are limited to what you're learning locally. So I don't know what there's advice while embedded with the military, and those when you're not are two very different pieces of information.
And some of the places that these journalists will be going aren't necessarily active war zones. So I think that idea of when you're in someone else's country, or in some cases where it's your own country, you have to think about the fact that the stories happening around you are the lives of the people who you're with, and respecting that, getting to know those colleagues, getting close to them, treating them as equals, really making sure you understand how indebted you are to them is a big part of what we try to teach at Ground Truth. I want to pivot, to use a word, to China.
That's a military word.
It's a word Hillary Clinton also had about turning away from Middle East foreign policy and pivoting to China. And I want to talk about your career there, because I think it's a really interesting place for us to reflect on World Press Freedom Day. But most importantly, I love the journey that it's where you began your career, and it's where you are going back to now as a reporter in the field. So maybe we'll start off with the quick scene of how you become a journalist in China. Take us back there and tell us.
China was a completely different country back in 1988 when I did move over to Beijing. My wife and I lived there from 88 to 89, and I was a lawyer at the time, and I was practicing.
Thank God we got you out of that.
There's some others around here too. I went to work doing mergers and acquisitions at a large firm in New York in 1987. And then the market just collapsed in October of 1987. And so there was no merging, no acquiring. So it was incredibly boring. And so since I had studied Chinese when I was at Michigan Law School, I told them after about 6 months there, I said, listen, I'm bored. I'm going to take a year off next year if I can. I'm going to go with some of my Chinese friends from Michigan. Can get me a job teaching young Chinese law students at the largest Chinese law school. And they said, all right. So I kind of went and represented them to a small degree. And so I asked my wife to marry me. And so 2 days after we got married, we moved over to Beijing in 1988.
So there was one merger.
There wasn't a sexual merge I've ever been engaged with. That was wonderful. And that one, actually, that deal is still there.
Still there? And then it became an acquisition at some point.
Or no bankruptcy yet. Except maybe financial. But anyway. So anyway, my wife and I, we moved over to Beijing in 1988, and I was still in the world of law and the young Chinese students, and I was learning China. I remember I had a big speech in a room about 400 young students, and I said at the end of this talk, I just talked about American law, international law, business, and I said at the end, if you have any questions, just pass up little cards of your questions. And there was not a single question about law or business or anything. It was all, who's your favorite celebrity? What kind of car do you have? If your wife and your mother were drowning in the river, which one would you save? And I said, well, I'd save my mom because I can get another wife. And I got a standing ovation. So then I knew, I literally lived in the school, in this dorm that had been, we were the first Westerners, the second year of Westerners even teaching at the school. And the dorm was remarkable. I mean, it was a small, tiny room filled with, straw beds we were sleeping on. The toilets were just holes. And the shower was in the middle of the campus. And my wife had moved over there with me. She was actually a vice president of a PR firm in New York at the time. Nothing to do, so bored, went in down. She went down and got a job at Hill and Knowlton, and they were just shocked. She walked in, she said, "Do you have any work for me? You don't have to move me here. I got a free place to stay. Can I come to work, please?" And that's what she did.
So you guys took a chance as a young couple and went out in the world. But how did journalism?
It wasn't a risk, though. That was just like an adventure. And then at the end of that year, all my students started this uprising against the government because of what was happening. And so all my classes stopped. And I had nothing else to do, so I knew one Western journalist. I'd never really known many before, and he was a sound man for CBS. And I said, listen, is there anything to do with CBS? Why you guys are doing this? And Dan Rather was coming over and all these people. I says, yeah, you can just get a job as a fixer, get us all the people around the city, because I knew all the people in the town and I could speak some of the language. So I got them around the streets, and then Tiananmen Square massacre happened. And I'll never forget what we witnessed was, it was a life-changing moment. But after that, I left China, kind of giving up on China, all of that, and we moved back to San Francisco, same law firm.
But wait, I gotta stop you there for a second. You take the risk to go out in the world, to go to a place where you had studied the language, you get set up, and suddenly, probably the most dramatic story in at least a decade was unfolding right in front of you. You then experienced journalism for the first time, and does the bug hit you right away?
Yeah, absolutely it did. Absolutely it did. But I also didn't have this brand new wife, and was I going to suddenly marry her and then just change everything in an instant? Well, 2 more years went back and practiced law, but by the end of after about a year and a half there, I was so bored by it, and all I could think about was the bug.
Right.
I wanted to do the same thing, and I almost had this ignorant assumption that maybe this is what all the stories are like. You go to amazing, there you are, covered in the square in the middle of Cairo, like an uprising, every other week. So I went back and I said, I think I needed change, Lee. And we were young, and we didn't have a kid yet,
right.
And then decided to get into journalism. And so I did, and I just started bumping around and went to a tiny little local station up in Redding, California. I think it was 125th Market. And shot everything, edited everything, fed everything on the live truck, do my own, shoot myself for stand-ups and things like that, and even live. I'll never forget my very first one. There was a train. I don't know if you guys have heard this story before, but there was a train that went off the rail up there and spilled some kind of chemicals. So that happened during the day. So I went, shot the whole thing, edited the thing, fed it back, had to drive my own live truck out to the spot. And I stand there in front of this rail and I'm just like sweating out of fear. Like I've never been live like this before. I'm just, what am I supposed to say? I knew what to say, but I didn't know what he's going to toss to me, all this thing. We didn't even have earplugs. We didn't have
the earpiece.
We had a walkie-talkie that we put on the tripod right here and just then turn it way down so you get feedback. And I was just literally standing with a microphone like this, and I said, well, you can see it. There's right here beside me that. And I went back, and there's my wife, like breastfeeding our baby. We had a baby right before we started, literally. And there she is, just freaking out, like, oh my God, what have we done? We saw they were living like in a trailer practically, and the woman who owned this place was walking down the street, and I said, hey, Mary, did you see me on television tonight? She said, yes, I did. And I said, what'd you think? She goes, that was the worst damn thing I've ever done. So that was the beginning of this.
Well, you somehow got it together and have from those beginnings stitched together an amazing career, one that is exemplary in terms of like really making it clear how much you love what you do, being out there, being on the ground, and really telling the stories that matter. And I think what I love about your story, and there's a lot I love about it, is that now you're going back to the field and back to China and back to telling those stories. And I want to just maybe end with a few questions where we could talk for a minute about the work you're doing now in China, having had the arc of the glamour of really sort of the anchor chair, all the spotlights on you. You were in every tabloid. Everyone was writing about this rising star and then this tragic accident in the field, this tragic crime, you might say, in the field. And suddenly your life shifts in an instant and you begin a new life, and you begin a life where you return to doing a lot of the things that first got you into the business. And I think maybe tell us about what you're doing in China now, what kind of reporting, and let's jump into a conversation there.
Talk about a year ago, China, which has always been so interested in it, Anyway, our correspondent was based over in China, had left, and they hadn't found somebody new, and I said, you know what, I'll go and I'll fill in over there and do it. And I said, I can't, like, I have my 2 kids here in New York, and I got my wife here, that I'm not gonna move the whole family over there, but I will go and spend way more than half a year over there and just go back and forth, because I got a lot of stuff to do here too. But I spend most of my time reporting out of China and other parts of Asia. In fact, I'm gonna head back to Vietnam, because Obama's gonna be heading there in the 22nd. So I'm gonna go back to Vietnam and then head back up to China. But you know, China is, to me, I'm just absolutely shocked that how little attention and reporting Asia generally gets, but now we're starting to see that this is becoming the most important thing. We've been so distracted as a country in the Middle East for all of these, for more than a decade. And that's going to be really where there's tons and tons of conflict. And like I said, I'm not going to cover war, but I'll cover conflict. And this one's fascinating. We covered the South China Sea, all within China. There's tons of conflict within. Most recently, we went down to the Philippines, where you're seeing a lot of these fishermen now going out to the places like Scarborough, those areas not far from Philippines, where they're being confronted by the Chinese ships to push them back. So it's just hard to get information in China.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about. One of the fault lines in the conflict you're covering now, small C conflict struggle. Maybe part of the reason we're not hearing enough from Asia isn't just the distraction of networks and major news organizations, but it's also, it's really hard to report there. There's a restriction on the press. They don't allow you very often to report freely. How do you deal with that? And what are the important sort of parts of the terrain we need to understand around freedom of information, freedom of the press, where you're working now? How do you navigate that?
Well, I mean, the thing, what I've always a big believer in journalists is try to just get to a place to see it before you can really report about it. The problem trying to go to a place is you're tracked a lot of times by the government. I mean, they tap certainly in your phone calls. WeChat is what we use all the time over there. We know that's being read. So you have to make it on phone calls where you know that if it's something you want, you need to hide.
Right.
In terms of, we just went up to Xinjiang, up to the northwestern part of China, which is very confrontational because it's the Muslim province area of China, territory. And what we learned is to go there, we have technically under Chinese law, there's a law passed in 2008 that gives journalists the right to travel freely around the country, report without permissions needed, except for Tibet. So you technically can go to Xinjiang legally to do so, but whenever you go to these places and they find you, they give this great offer to you to have a guide to show you around, and because you don't know much about the area.
A guide meaning
a guide will never leave your side. Yeah, minder. Yeah, exactly. So in order to report and shoot freely, what we figured out was to fly up to Xinjiang and land, check in the hotel late, so they can't check in easily, leave early in the morning to the next place, also check in late, leaving early, and then they can't find you. The last time we went was we traveled all over the place, shooting a million things, interviewing tons of people, and finally they realized, because we have to get your passport everywhere, they realized where we are, and then suddenly they pulled up next to us and gave us a beautiful guide around. At that point we said, well, actually it's interesting, we're leaving the country now. So we're able to get it that way, and that's the best ways to talk to the people.
And do you feel like America knows enough or understands enough the ways in which information is restricted in China, and what needs to be done about that? Like maybe this is just a concluding remarks. If this day really is about world press freedom, what do we need to know about China, and what do we as a community of journalists need to do to be sure we push hard for China to open up?
I think people have to be ready to be kicked out of the country in order to report freely and openly. I know you said earlier about trying to find some local people to tell you facts about the country, because I think if those who come from outside of a country and they report there, they're so they're so biased, you know, favoring your own country that you go in, that sometimes you have to live in these places to really understand not just the suffering from the people, but also what the government's trying to accomplish. So sometimes to go in a place like that, you got to show evidence of balance on your reporting. If the story is abuse of people and prison time, people thrown in prison, arrested by police, beaten, raped, sexual abuse. Those stories, there's only one side to that story, there's no question about it. But other ones, sometimes you have to balance, I think, in position. But be ready to take the risk that you're going to get kicked out the next year. I mean, for example, New York Times is always threatened endlessly that they're going to get booted out. But it'd be such bad PR for the government of China in order to do something at a place like that. The ones they usually get rid of are ones that are not as well known. So in some ways, the position would be for those that do have a very public appearance there, is to go ahead and take those risks to report on something. I mean, if I went illegally into Tibet, I'm sure I probably would be kicked out. But going to a place like Xinjiang, which would be second in line behind Tibet going into, you're not allowed to really say anything about that. So you can't talk about Tiananmen Square, you can't talk about Tibet, and you can't talk about Thailand. Or Taiwan. Taiwan, the 3 Ts, you're not supposed to talk about it. So talk about them all the time. And let's see what happens. But one of the big problems right now is, Xi Jinping, the president, is more powerful and more strict compared to anybody since Mao Zedong. So it's getting more dangerous. More local correspondents, reporters for China are being kicked out, taken. They just disappear. So it's getting worse.
That balance between a journalist like yourself from a big American network pushing the edge of the envelope, I know comes with a balance of caring about the local reporters who assist you in your staff or who are part of your team. And there's always going to be a balance there. It's disturbing to know things are getting worse. I think we have to keep an eye on it.
The woman, our local translator slash AP that's with us, grew up and she lives in China. She's a citizen of China. She's never really spent much time outside the country. So just traveling around a place like Xinjiang and get that story digital alone, we would fuzz her face out and never mention her name. So I mean, I'd like to give her full credit for this kind of program, but we can't. You want to, because she would be targeted, and she has been many times.
It's so important for those local colleagues to help you bring the stories forward, and that's a perfect example of it. We're going to count on you to keep pushing new ground. We're expecting you to be kicked out pretty soon.
That's my goal. Nothing else to lose.
We need to call it there. Thank you, Bob. Thank you so much. So what we thought we would do is we're going to invite Deb Amos to come up. Deb really needs no introduction, but I sure do love you being here. Thanks for joining us. Deb and Bob are both on the board of advisors of the GroundTruth Project and are both unbelievable colleagues in the sense of their generosity to another generation of correspondents. They've both exhibited that time and time again. If anyone wants to slip out and get a coffee quick while we're introducing this would be the time, but don't leave because we're not going to take a break unless you absolutely need coffee or need to go to the bathroom. Those are the two things which journalists will be excused from. Deb's work in the last few years really covering the Arab Spring has been extraordinary. It's been extraordinary in the way she's found ways to really get at the story and stay with the story and find a way to tell the story through the Syrian people telling their own story, through social media, through the ways in which she's been able to tap into their stories. I'm going to invite the 4 journalists who will join us on the panel to come up. Deb is going to introduce them, but Ben and Isma'il, Justine and Tracy, come on up. And I'm going to just turn over to Deb, and I love this conversation. I'll get my print phone out of here. The conversation I really hope can go now across some generations, across cultures. I'm so proud of We have 2 Global Post GroundTruth reporting fellows on this side, 2 OPC fellows on that side. We didn't plan it this way, but it's nice. The Overseas Press Club offers wonderful fellowships to young correspondents, of which Ben and Isma'il have both had them. We also do about 25 to 30 fellowships a year for reporting out in the field, and we're really proud to have Justine doing climate change reporting for us right now, and Tracy has done global health for us in the past. So Deb, I turn it over to you.
I was asked to just say a few words about the long span of a career and always head for the door when journalists start telling war stories. I will keep it short. My first war was in 1982 covering Beirut. I was woefully unprepared for conflict, as we all were. Our companies really had no plan for what would happen if we got into trouble. We arrived in the dock in Juney, and people were water skiing, and I said to myself, what kind of war is this? And what you realize quickly is wars usually are one community against another, and that's what we were watching. That hasn't changed. What has changed is, back then, almost all sides needed you to tell their story, and so they were more mindful of your safety because they needed you. That has completely changed. With social media, nobody really needs us. And they are much less mindful of our safety. And as Charlie brought out in the last panel, often they target us because we get in the way, we don't get the message, we are a problem for them. So we are targeted, and we all have to think of that. Now, of course, I have the 24-hour tracker on my phone that I have to be careful not to make a butt call on because it wakes up 5 people at 4 o'clock in the morning. We have security advisors. I can turn a tourniquet in 9 seconds, and that is what you have to prepare for when you go in the field. The second thing that's changed is how we get into this business. Charlie and I have been talking about this. Bob, you have, in some ways, a traditional career path. I worked for 2 organizations my entire career, and I didn't plan on being a foreign correspondent for this long, but it just happened. That's almost impossible today for the young people that you see on this panel. And what is so interesting about all 4 of them is each one of them has a different model for how they got here. And I think that for young journalists, this is probably the most important piece of information. In some ways secondary to your safety, which you will do because you know you have to. But figuring out how to get into this business is a little bit harder. And so interesting to go over models. And that's how we're going to begin this panel. And I will do a short introduction to everybody here. I'm going to start with Justine. Oops, I've done it. Let me start with Tracy. Tracy Jarrett is a Peabody award-winning producer for NBC News with experience covering civil unrest and social justice issues across the U.S., as well as health in the U.S. and South Africa. Justine Calma, a GroundTruth reporting fellow covering global health, climate change, gender, and identity across the United States and in Southeast Asia. Isma'il Kushkush is exactly what Charlie's talking about, a local fixer who has joined our tribe and was a damn good reporter when you were a fixer, and now you get the credit that is due. A student at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism with experience covering extremism, child soldiers, and pro-democracy protests in sub-Saharan Africa. And Ben Taub, a contributor to The New Yorker on jihadism in Europe and war in Syria, came on another path through a university course and then just wrote the hell out of the stuff that he knew about. So let me start on this side. And can you just talk a little bit, Tracy, about how you came to be a foreign correspondent and how you came to the business?
Right. So I can thank Charlie for that in many ways, because I was a student at Columbia Journalism School and I knew that I was interested in foreign reporting, and I sort of didn't know how to start because it can be a daunting task to break into. I met Charlie, and I came on as a global health fellow for Global Post at the time, and he took a chance, as he does now, on a young journalist, and just sort of said, okay, you're going to South Africa and you're going to report on HIV and you're going to tell these stories. And that was really my first shot. But because I did that, I was able then, when I started at NBC, to point to that experience and go after more fellowships and really start to build the resume of someone who was interested in foreign reporting. So for me, getting abroad really came down to fellowships and people who were interested in taking a chance on journalists who didn't have a lot of international experience to start off with.
Okay, Justine?
Sure. So I think I just got into it following stories that I cared about. I started off as a global health reporter. I really care about writing, reporting on health, and there are so many intersections that I ended up doing climate change reporting for the GroundTruth Project, because climate change does have a lot of impacts on people's health. And I think for me as well, being a Filipino American and immigrant woman, I always was interested in these sort of transnational stories. I have a transnational experience growing up, and so I was born in the Philippines and raised in California. I studied international studies as an undergrad, and when Charlie and another GroundTruth editor, Marissa, needed someone to go to Hong Kong and southern China to report on climate change, I was all for it. And I was able to bring some of my background studying and having family in the region and use that to help me do something that I otherwise, sort of felt unprepared for, but was really a great launching pad for me.
Okay. Isma'il, yours is a little bit, you have it, keep going outside.
Yeah, journalism was not the original plan. I went to Sudan where, my background is Sudanese, and I intended to stay 4 months just to reconnect with family. I hadn't been to Sudan in a long time. And I was interested in journalism as a side interest. And, Sudan at the time that I went was interesting for news agencies, Darfur, South Sudan. And I started writing for local English outlets and some regional, but I was also a fixer for a number of international outlets that came, CNN, New York Times, Al Jazeera English. And every year I planned to come back to the United States, and I'd stay longer. I'd apply for graduate school, at different schools, get accepted, and stay a little bit longer. And 4 months turned into 8 years. But it was really the Arab Spring, I think, when I decided this is really what I wanted to do. And the referendum in South Sudan. I mean, the referendum showed how little Northern Sudanese knew about South Sudan. The coverage of South Sudan was, for a Northern audience, was just so little that they were surprised when the South split. But at the same time, on the other side, the Arab Spring, I was following Egypt very closely. The role of journalism was just amazing, and that's when I decided that I'm going to stick to journalism, and I ended up writing in other parts of East Africa, Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, Burundi.
Ben?
I was studying philosophy in college, and I was a junior when a couple of journalists came to my university, and I took their classes, and one of them, I just thought that she lived such a cool life that I wanted to do anything that sounded something close to that. And so I took a year off school, and I'd saved up some money from various projects and started traveling. Ultimately ended up at the Turkish-Syrian border, where I lived for the summer of 2013, which happened to be a period of a lot of change in the threat assessments for journalists who were going into Aleppo. I wasn't crossing, I was just living in Kilis on the Turkish side. And as we were sort of watching a lot of the extremism problems grow more and more prevalent, I focused on ISIS for the ensuing year as I finished up college, as sort of a side project, just trying to learn everything I could about it. And then I returned to Kilis the following summer, and I met 3 of the strangest, or the least expected people that I had met a lot of weird people in Kilis. Everyone knows these border towns are full of jihadists and journalists and lunatics and just about everyone. But the 3 guys who totally took me by surprise were 3 Belgian fathers who were going into ISIS territory to try to retrieve their jihadi sons. And so I stayed in touch with them, and when I went went to grad school for journalism, ended up spending a lot of time focusing on ISIS in Belgium because of these stats, unaware when I started out that was going to be a focal point for the jihadi problem in Europe.
Let's stay with you, Ben, because I want to switch the topic. You know, this morning, people did a lot about security, and this now is foremost on journalists' minds. You really have to have some training before you go out. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about how you think about it. When you go to a border town, which seems quite normal, you really have to be aware to know what the threats are. So when you're planning a trip, you know, talk a little bit about how you think about that and what your advice is to people who are going off to do this.
Certainly. Well, for instance, if I were going to Kilis today, I wouldn't stay overnight. I certainly wouldn't stay in the hotel that I stayed in those 2 summers, without any question. It is far too dicey a place. There's too many, frankly, spies around from all various groups, or people. I mean, you don't have to get kidnapped by ISIS to get kidnapped by ISIS. You get picked up by someone who sells you down the line, and that can happen on either side of the border. And but you also don't have to go to where the shooting is happening in order to cover the war. There are refugees coming out, and they know the war a lot better than you're going to know just by showing up. There are documents being smuggled out of Syria that are in Europe that you can go find the people that are working with those. There are jihadi problems in Syria emanating from Europe, so you can go to their home areas and sort of figure out what happened here before the war that created this flow into Syria in the first place. I've never been in any front lines. I've been within sight and sound of shelling, but never within range of actually getting hit by anything. And I have enormous respect for journalists who do take those risks, but I find that doing print, I don't have to.
And let's just reiterate that point. So I've often said this about, you don't have to go to the front lines, but you know that you can feel that rush of wind as all of your colleagues are moving that way. What do you say to yourself? How do you resist not getting excited and going off to do that?
Well, that summer of 2013, I was not a journalist. I was someone who was trying to learn about what journalism was. And so one of my goals during that summer was to meet journalists who were going in and have drinks with them at the bar and talk to them about their lives and their motivations, and whether after several years of doing this, they feel as though it's worth it and a life that they want to continue to live and a life that I would want to live. And during that period of time, I knew that what helped against that pull, which was, there were many times in which various Syrian fixers and friends would make offers to take me into Aleppo safely. And at the beginning of the time that I was there, it could have been done. Towards the end, absolutely not. But one of the reasons I didn't was I knew that I was not a good enough writer, a good enough reporter, a good enough photographer to get material that would be worth the risk for anyone, including me, but also including the Syrians who are in my car, who could be targeted because they're around me. Also, as a factor, I can kind of pass in southern Turkey and in Syria, Egypt, as long as I don't open my mouth. I don't know what it's like. I haven't worked in hostile environments where I can't blend in with as long as my mouth's shut. So I can't understand that degree of risk because I've kind of had just the luxury of kind of being able to blend in.
Isma'il, this is such an interesting topic about identity and what you look like and how you use that. And you've been a fixer and you've been a journalist. And when you're a fixer, for correspondents who come in from the outside, is there a moment where you think, I am risking my life for these people? They make me more visible than I would normally be.
Yes, that actually happened to me in Darfur. When I was fixing for an American outlet, and these are things that I wasn't aware of this at the time, but fully aware of it. After that, has been coming situations that one's appearance, ethnicity, or perception of what you are can play a big role in how you're treated. I was in an IDP camp in Darfur, and I easily passed as one of the pro-government militias in Dawit. And I was mob attacked and beaten up and almost killed. And for reasons I wasn't aware of going into that would be an issue, but it was certainly something that I think when it's important to evaluate how you will be perceived. I think when you go into a situation, you might have an idea that you're a journalist, you're here to do a job, but it's also important to think how people will think of you. But also it works in other ways. I mean, I've covered protests in Khartoum, and it was much easier for me to cover than my white colleagues, and I could easily dress up in traditional clothes, blend in, go into the protests that were coming out of mosques on Fridays, go into the mosque, easily cover, get quotes, and get out quickly. That was very difficult for other colleagues. So identity and the perception of who you are definitely plays a role.
Okay, I know that you're going to this. Both of you. Let's talk about it.
Sure, thanks. So I recently came back from the Philippines, where I was reporting on the intersections of climate change and in human trafficking, and I'm going there as a Filipino American, so definitely identity is a huge part of how I crafted my risk assessment, which Frank Smythe did a great job doing, very targeted, specific risk assessments and contingency plans with us, which is one of the biggest things I learned, is that there's no blanket safety plan for every journalist or every situation. It depends on where you are and who you are. And I think for me, as we were crafting that risk assessment, I kind of look at my my security on 3 different levels. Myself, just as a journalist, reporting in places where there's a lot of, I wasn't in a conflict zone, but I was in red light districts, which pose their own risks. So, looking at being a journalist and thinking about organized crime, thinking about corrupt police or other officials who might not be happy with the reporting that we're doing. So there's that layer. Then there's also the fact that I'm a woman reporting in a red light district. So there's, of course, the constant thought of sexual harassment, which happens even here on the streets of New York. So there's the sexual harassment, there's dealing with topics of gender-based violence, the thought of that happening while you're on the field, but also the thought of that as a woman, I have my own experiences with that as well, and I'm talking to other people who are experiencing it or who have experienced it, and that's gonna, something I have to be mindful of how that's affecting me personally, emotionally, in my reporting. So there's being a woman, and then there's this me being a Filipino woman, being a woman of color. That affects me everywhere. I mean, there's a stereotype of Filipinas being domestic workers, so when I'm in Europe or even in East Asia, I'm often mistaken for being a domestic worker, which...
Could you look at my bed, please?
Yeah, so I've been asked before, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be working? I've been mistaken for a domestic worker traveling with journalists. And so sometimes that has a certain access to it, but at other times it can be, it has other things that I have to deal with. But then being here, being in the Philippines and being a Filipino American is kind of strange, because it was strange, and it was also a good opportunity because I could play up my Filipina-ness and I could play up my American-ness, and I had to understand when to use each one. I was working in a team with 2 other reporters who are also Filipino, and were actually much stronger on the ground than me because they're based in the Philippines. I was only born there. But we were at times mistaken for the girls who work in the bars. That was one thing that happened. There were times where we wanted to kind of go undercover and incognito, but there were other times where we had to speak English and say that we were, Filipino Americans, so that we wouldn't be, necessarily harassed in the same way. At the same time, we couldn't get into the girly bars or the brothels. As Filipino women, you can't get in unless you're accompanied by a foreigner, so we had to we had to, negotiate our way around that. So there were a lot of things that we were really trying to strategize around. I think, though, I felt very well prepared. GroundTruth really, I think, invested in me as a reporter, but also invested in my security and safety. And I haven't had to report in natural disasters yet or epidemics, but Frank and his security training, I've already received training for that. And I came in with a really strong risk assessment. But at the end of the day, really, a lot of it was thinking on the ground, and a lot of it was relying on the local knowledge of both the other colleagues that I was working with, and also just the people who were there, right? Because even Filipino journalists are not Filipino women working in brothels. So we actually, one of the best things we did is one of the other reporters I was working with knew a girl who worked in a similar kind of bar, and we just had dinner with her and asked her, what should we do? How should we go into this place? And prior to our conversation with her, we had this thought of, we'll just go in and try and blend in with other girls. And she told us, no, you can't do that. One, if you go in doing that, they're gonna know right away that you're not from them. And then second, they'll see you as a threat, as someone who's taking away business from them. So we had to rethink our entire, our, not disguises, but our, we had to rethink the way that we were gonna enter. And so I think without her, we wouldn't have gotten the access that we ended up getting without myself, without working with the colleagues who were based in the Philippines. I wouldn't have gotten the access that I would have gotten and stayed safe, because they know the place really well, and they don't like some foreigner coming in and telling them how to be safe. So I had to really listen to others. That's what I've learned.
Tracy, you have a different experience, and you've done lots of foreign reporting, but what's interesting is you've also done it domestically. The things that now we didn't think we had to worry about as domestic correspondents, but we do. Can you talk a little bit about the way that you've covered domestic stories and how you've had to think about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of the same issues. So over the past year, I spent a lot of time in Ferguson reporting the protesting there, Baltimore, and here in New York. And you're taking a lot of the same things into consideration, and you sort of don't think that you have to do that on your own turf in sometimes. And so Ferguson was particularly interesting because I did get more access than some of my colleagues because I'm young and I'm Black, and I looked like a lot of the people who were organizing there, and so they trusted me, they wanted to talk to me. But being young and Black in protests also meant I was a target for the police and for a lot of the things that were going on, tear gas, I had the gas masks on, things like that. And going with an organization like NBC was great because they did train us. They trained us on how to use a gas mask. We always had to have a buddy system sort of reporting. And so they did a good job with that, but you're definitely thinking, what is the story I'm trying to get? How am I going to approach it, and what's going on around me, and how does that affect how I'm going after the story? And part of that too was, NBC was very wise to get us security. So we had security coming with us at night when covering any of the protesting that was going on, or riots that sort of started to happen. But what do you do when you're in Ferguson and your security person is a white man who's retired from the police department in Ferguson? That also put us at risk in some way. So you had to think about, okay, well, there's security and they're here to protect me, but how can I also protect myself if security maybe makes the situation worse, right? And so that was one thing that we definitely had to think about. And so I would say, if you are going into a place that sort of is a conflict zone, even if it seems to be in your backyard in some place where you kind of know the landscape, you have to think about those things. Maybe you want security that sort of fits in, that looks like, that's not gonna make you stand out more. And you wanna think about, okay, if I'm going after the story of the protesters, how can I use how I look or how I fit in to tell that story? But if I am on the front lines when police are throwing tear gas, how do I also be smart about how I look and how I present myself so that I don't also put myself at greater risk.
You know, these are new issues at NPR. We had a big tall Brit, and you couldn't bring him anywhere because it would make you more vulnerable. So they hired a woman. It's possible. There are women security agents. It's like, you just have to think about it. Do you think it was harder domestically because you don't expect it? Or did you find that the company actually had thought it out before you went to Ferguson and knew that you were going to need some extra training?
I think NBC took it really seriously beforehand in terms of planning, right? They're a large organization, it's corporate journalism, and so they're always assessing risk, and they're always figuring out who they're gonna send. Is that person prepared? Can we make sure there's training for everyone? So we did have to go through training, and they had a, in Ferguson and in Baltimore, they had compounds for us where we knew we could always go back there to be safe. What happens is you do think, okay, well, I work for this organization that's taken all these precautions, I'm going to be okay. And what they don't expect is that it might not work out that way. So for instance, journalists were a huge target in Ferguson. The people did not like journalists. They did not want us there. They particularly hated CNN. And what happens then when the rioters started shooting at and throwing things at the journalism compounds? And so I think you weren't even safe in the safe areas that they set up for you, and that was what was unexpected. I sort of think there was this level of, they took so much precaution, we're gonna be okay, and I would just say you still can't really let your guard down, even if you think that security is set up for you, because anything can happen even here at home. And emotionally it can be harder, I think, at home to distance yourself from a story, right? So you see people who look like you and who have similar backgrounds as you feeling really passionately about something, and you have to remove yourself from that and report the story.
And it just means that nobody needs us anywhere to tell their story. I'd like to open this up for questions, and I hope you will come back and join us and make it 2 against 4. We have till 2, and I think maybe you can take that stool and come and join us. Thanks. So let me open it up to questions from the audience.
Hi, my name's Sam. I'm a freelance journalist, and I work mostly about or on or about the Arab world. But anyway, since I came to New York and started doing freelancing from the U.S. about the Arab world, something I've never done before, just in the past few months, I've had to kind of broaden my scope. I can't just, survive off that alone. But it makes me think a lot about the issue of becoming an expert in a subject, a place, or a region. So I just wanted to know what you all, the newer journalists, think about that, and if you've come up against these issues. If, you're pulled into like, oh wow, I want to explore, agricultural issues, but you have no background in that, or you say, I want to go to the Arctic, but all your experience is in the Philippines. Whether you resist that pull or you just go for it, because I think there's pros and cons.
Yes, in every career you have to ask yourself, do I stay a regional specialist, or am I a foreign correspondent? Ben, you and I have talked about this. Whether you want to be a jihadi expert all the time.
The answer to that is no, because it's a bit exhausting, some of the material. So pivoting out of jihadi world for a while, kind of shifted back to Syrian government, and something I was really interested in but didn't know anything about was criminal accountability, and so I work on. I guess it's a little different if you're working on. There's a challenge and an advantage to long form stuff. The advantage is that you get months and months to learn about it and make sure that you understand it before you publish anything on it. The disadvantage is that then you can't do another piece about that. So you can't, you can do smaller, shorter pieces, but you can't do another long form piece that kind of comes out of it. There's nothing that's going to be in the same reporting process that immediately opens up your next story. But yeah, I don't know, I find that it's, you can pivot between projects based on certain themes, and allowing yourself the time to learn about a new world is really fun. But I mean, it's certainly a challenge financially, as you're experiencing as anyone is. I don't really have a good answer. Maybe.
I think there is no good answer.
Yeah.
Isma'il, so do you long for doing an Antarctic series?
I think, the basics are the same, and once you're sent into one area or region, you start to learn, the same elements of any story. I went into Somalia. I thought Sudan was sophisticated and complicated. Somalia is another story, but I spent time studying, meeting experts before going into reading what was written before, and I think it's just doing your homework, and it's not impossible to tackle.
Are you a pivoter, or will you stay with the Philippines?
I'll stay within certain realms, but they're kind of large realms, so not just the Philippines, but Asia is huge. I could spend a lifetime learning about China and not know a thing, really. So I also think there's a strength to knowing your subject really well, and I became a reporter also because I felt like there are not a lot of Filipino journalists, and the field, I think, really benefits from having folks who come from really diverse backgrounds and have diverse pieces of knowledge, and so I want to bring kind of where I come from to the work that I do. But of course, I don't want that to be limiting as well. I would hate for someone to say you can only cover Asia, so there's a balance, I guess.
Tracy, you do health, and you do Ferguson.
So when I started off, my first job was with Charlie being a health reporter. So health was sort of, I didn't have a background in health. I was just really extremely interested in HIV, specifically women living with HIV, and so I learned about health a lot about health along the way during that reporting journey. But when that ended, I was a general assignment reporter at NBC for 3 years. So I was covering a different thing every day. It just so happened there was a lot of civil unrest last year that focused around race, and so that sort of became my thing for the year. And now I'm a full-time health reporter or producer for NBC, and so I've kind of gone from having a lot of freedom in telling different kinds of stories and just chasing sort of what was interesting to me or what was happening, to now having a focus. And I think that there are definitely pros and cons to each, right? So in health, if I feel bogged down by all of the medical surveys that are coming out, there's ways to still, like, at the end of the day, it's about people and it's about really good storytelling. And so if you can prove that you know how to report, you know how to get across the emotions that people are experiencing, and you can tell a story really well, you can report on anything, and that goes for sort of any specialty. And so in health, if I don't want to focus on something about a new cancer study, I can say, okay, well, one thing that was really interesting to me is when I was doing general assignments, I focused on homelessness, and the guy had a drug addiction problem. So, okay, that's kind of health related. Now I'm gonna go do a story on drug addiction for the health unit, right? And so I think you can jump around as long as those foundational skills of reporting are there and strong, and you've been able to prove that. I think people will give you the space to experiment.
Bob, you've had a very interesting career arc. You started in China, and then now you're back in China. So is there something to be said for you don't really lose that first love of story, and you can come back to it?
I was going to say that too. It's not so much the topic. It's what do you think the need? If there's a need for that topic, it's a good thing to follow. But I think also just follow your heart, do something. Because don't forget, in our world, we are so underpaid, and we take so many risks that you better love what you're doing, or you should probably go on to a different job. Because I don't think there's a way to sell that to people. I think there's two things too. You're talking about whether somebody would buy a particular story that you're doing, or someone hiring you into a job like Tracy, for example, at NBC to hire you. I think obviously for a story, just the uniqueness of the story is one that people will buy. You want to be hired to somebody or even sell the next one for credibility, that if that's ones that you report a lot on that topic, that's much more impressive And then finally, to be hired into a place like ABC or NBC or NPR, I think you have to be reporting on a topic that they desperately want to cover. Like right now, I think a specialty in campaigns for president, I mean, you could get there's a lot of need for you to do that. So, I mean, listen, being an expert in the Middle East right now is a lot harder to sell than it was 10 years ago. So it's harder to get that job. So I think all those elements are important for you to try to get into journalism.
And if you are an expert on covering a campaign, you better pivot fast because your expertise won't be saleable.
Actually, if you are an expert, I think you should run for president. Give us a chance.
Didn't that happen?
Yes.
I would say the thing that draws, I think, everyone into this story, it's a similar arc, is that we love doing it. I mean, I just really do it because I love it. And I have done it in a lot of different ways. I've covered cops, I've covered courts, I've covered national, I've covered foreign, and I've loved all of them for different reasons. For me, it started as a little kid. Yeah, I was 13 years old. We had a house painting business with my brothers. And I was so small, I had to run the radio down on the ground, so I didn't get to go up on the ladders. And I would always put on NPR, which was starting out covering Watergate. And also a guy named Danny Schechter, news dissector from Boston. He was this awesome talent. And I thought, man, that's so cool. I want to do that. I want to do that kind of work. I still think Danny Schechter's pretty cool. He passed away last year. Fantastic journalist. But that was a time when you could see a vision. There was blue sky. You could see, I'm going to go to a smaller newspaper, and then I'm going to go to a bigger newspaper, and then I'm going to get a shot at foreign maybe. And it's easy to think of those days and that blue sky as the best times of journalism. And I do not think that's the case. I think right now is the most breathtaking moment in journalism in our lifetime. This is a revolutionary moment. There are brand new ways to tell stories. There are incredible opportunities before you. There are stories that are so important. So when GroundTruth says we want to train a new generation of correspondents to tell the stories of your generation, we mean it. You've got amazing stories that we need to know about. And we, Deb, Bob, myself, and the other veteran correspondents of this crowd, we're not going to be the ones to do it, and we're not going to be the ones to figure out how to do it. You are. We need all of you to not only be great journalists. There's a new little skill set you need. You also need to be an entrepreneur. You need to market your career, and you need to think about how you're going to add to this this really dramatically unfolding moment in journalism. And I think I want to just really encourage you, think entrepreneurially. Think about starting a website. I mean, I really admire Mohammed Abdel Fattah, comes from Tahrir, comes to America. He's already starting this whole new coverage plan from Tahrir to the Republican Convention this summer in Ohio.
Yeah, right.
You're going to need a lot more training in civil unrest this summer. So I would say stay with the love. You know, I had a really interesting talk at a prep school, and they asked me to talk, and I had my whole little speech written on passion. And one of the students said to me, you know, all of your generation talks about passion all the time. And it's as if it's some divine thing that will descend upon us. And the truth is it won't. That's not what passion is. Passion isn't like all of us were just suddenly like Paul on the road to Damascus, bam, we got it, we're going to be journalists. What it is when you love something, like all of us do, you stay with it and you get good at it. And it's what I so admire in everyone on this panel, but particularly the young people. You're doing amazing work because you love it, and that's always going to be a good guide for you.
We're done.
We're done?
We're 3 minutes, we're 4 minutes before 2.
Well, awesome. I want to thank the panel then, and Deb, thank you so much. I'm just going to say thank you to everyone for coming all the way uptown. This is a beautiful setting. I hope you had a wonderful day. We have a little bit of time. You can still be a little truant at work, I hope, and hang out and talk a little bit. I do have to head to the airport because we're going to Washington, D.C. to go to the next big event today, which is the James Foley Legacy Fund. We'll be honoring our really great colleague David Rode tonight. And it's a really important event. So I do need to leave in about 10 minutes. So forgive me if I don't have enough time to catch up. I would love to see all of you, but I can't. But before we go, I do just want to say we've developed a Ground Truth Middle East Reporting Fellowship where we're trying to make it really in the spirit of Jim Foley. And what I mean by that is to be about people who are caught in the middle of conflict. But we've actually, in honor of Jim Foley, tried to make it really clear we want story proposals for this fellowship that are not in the middle of conflict. There's a way to cover this story, as Ben has figured out, that is really, as Ben has figured out, that is really powerful, and you don't have to go right into the middle of gunfire and of active combat to tell that story. So last year we gave the fellowship out to a woman named Dalia Mortada, who did an amazing story of a bakery from Aleppo to Istanbul to Germany, one family bakery, and its journey, which is following sort of the refugee journey. It's on our podcast, the Ground Truth Podcast. It's an amazing piece of journalism, wonderful storytelling. So this year, we're giving out the fellowship again, and our managing editor, Kevin Grant, is going to break some news right now. You might need to come up here, Kevin, because I don't think you have a mic on.
Can I borrow a mic?
Sure.
Thanks, sir.
And announce our winner for this year.
So I'm very pleased to announce that the Lebanese-American journalist Jad Khalil will be our next Middle East reporting fellow. Jad is based in Cairo. He's been based there since 2011. He started reporting for the Egypt Independent for a while. You may know that it closed in 2013. So he actually co-founded a new publication, and as following sort of what Charlie said, has been really an entrepreneur and sort of a pioneer in the way that he's trying to cover the Middle East. And so, he's going to focus on music, and he's going to get deep into the Syrian music scene as a way to sort of bring the audience, we hope, into this deeper story through culture, through music. So we're very excited for Jad, looking forward to working with him on radio and text pieces. So yeah, let's hear it for Jad.
Okay, as Obama said, we're out. Thank you.